You wouldn't know what to do with nice things anyway. You'd probably just leave them in a desk drawer at a public school. My mother, Connie Hartley, sneered as she dropped my grandmother's 18-karat gold wedding ring into a $350 Lululemon tote bag. I am Diana Hartley, 34 years old, and for the last 12 years, I have dedicated my life to being a third-grade teacher at Millbrook Elementary in a town that most people only drive through to get to somewhere better. I make exactly $42,180 a year after taxes, a salary that barely covers my rent and the mounting cost of supplies for my classroom. I drive a 2014 Honda Civic in a faded shade of urban titanium metallic, a car that groans every time I turn the ignition and currently has a slow, persistent leak in the front left tire that requires me to stop at the gas station on the corner of Maple and 2nd Street every 3 days to pump in 4 minutes of air. 3 months ago, my grandmother, Evelyn Marsh, died of a stroke at 84, and since that moment, my mother has turned the mourning process into a cold, calculated yard sale where she acts as both the auctioneer and the only customer. The funeral was barely over before Connie was in my grandmother's Victorian house on Elm Street, peeling back the plastic covers on the furniture and cataloging the silver like she was an insurance adjuster rather than a grieving daughter. My mother has always lived a life defined by the weight of her jewelry and the brand names on her handbags. She stood there in the center of the dusty living room, wearing a tailored black wool coat that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, her eyes scanning the room for anything of value that she hadn't already pilfered. The ring she had just tossed into her bag was a delicate heirloom piece featuring a hand-carved band and a small, brilliant-cut diamond that caught the late afternoon sun filtering through the heavy velvet curtains. To her, it was just another asset to be appraised, but to me, it was the ring my grandmother wore every day while she baked cinnamon rolls and told me stories about the world beyond our small town. Connie's disdain for my profession was not a new development, but it felt particularly sharp today. She viewed my choice to teach as a personal failure, a betrayal of the Hartley family's unspoken requirement to accumulate wealth and status. In her mind, working at a public school was a form of voluntary poverty that made me unworthy of the finer things our family had managed to hoard over the decades. She didn't notice the way I gripped the back of the floral-patterned armchair, my knuckles turning white against the fabric. I watched her move to the mahogany secretary desk, her fingers tapping against the wood as she looked for more treasures. The room smelled of lavender sachets and old paper, a scent that usually brought me comfort but now felt suffocating. I thought about the secret that had been sitting in a dark vault since 1998, a piece of information that my grandmother had whispered to me during one of our last visits, something that would eventually unravel the carefully constructed narrative my mother had spent years perfecting. But for now, I remained silent, a spectator in the systematic dismantling of a woman's life. My mother reached for a crystal vase, a heavy piece of Waterford that grandmother used for the peonies from her garden. She didn't even look at it with affection, only checking the bottom for the acid-etched mark that proved its authenticity. The contrast between us was never more apparent than in that moment. While she calculated the resale value of the furniture, I was thinking about the 24 students waiting for me on Monday morning, children who needed me to be more than just a teacher. I thought about the $15 I had spent out of my own pocket last week to buy a winter coat for a boy in my class whose parents couldn't afford one. My mother would see that as a waste of resources, a sentimental gesture that yielded no return on investment. She adjusted the strap of her Lululemon bag, the high-performance fabric clashing with the timeless elegance of the room. She was a woman of the present, obsessed with the latest trends and the opinions of people she didn't even like. I was a woman of the past and the future, rooted in the lessons my grandmother taught me and invested in the potential of the children I taught every day. The silence in the house was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional sound of a car passing by outside and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. My mother moved toward the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floors. I followed her, feeling like a ghost in my own family history. She began opening the cabinets, her movements efficient and ruthless. She didn't want the mismatched mugs or the chipped plates that held memories of Sunday dinners. She wanted the fine china, the sets that had been saved for special occasions that never seemed to happen often enough. She pulled out a stack of Noritake gold-rimmed plates, stacking them on the counter with a clatter that made me flinch. "You should be grateful I'm taking care of all this, Diana," she said without looking back at me. "It's a lot of work to liquidate an estate of this size. You wouldn't have the first clue how to handle the logistics." I looked at her back, at the rigid line of her shoulders and the perfectly coiffed hair that hadn't changed in 20 years. She was right in one sense. I didn't care about the logistics of liquidation. I cared about the letters tucked into the back of the desk drawer, the ones my grandfather wrote from the front lines during the war. I cared about the recipe cards with grandmother's shaky handwriting, stained with vanilla and butter. These were the things Connie ignored, the things she deemed worthless because they couldn't be traded for a newer car or a better zip code. But even as she worked to erase the presence of Evelyn Marsh from the house, she was oblivious to the fact that she was setting the stage for her own undoing. The vault was waiting, and the documents inside were about to become very relevant. I walked over to the kitchen window and looked out at my Civic parked at the curb. The front left tire looked flatter than it had this morning, a physical manifestation of the slow leak that seemed to be draining the life out of my bank account and my spirit. I thought about the 4 minutes of air I would have to pay for later, a small recurring tax on my existence. My mother's SUV, a 2024 Mercedes-Benz GLE in a gleaming obsidian black, sat behind it, a fortress of leather and technology that represented everything she valued. She hadn't offered to help me with my car, just as she hadn't offered to help me with my student loans or my classroom expenses. To her, my struggles were a choice, a consequence of my refusal to play the game she had mastered. She turned around, holding a silver-plated serving tray like it was a weapon. "I'll be back tomorrow with the movers for the larger pieces," she announced, her voice echoing in the empty-feeling kitchen. "I've already contacted an appraiser for the rugs. Don't touch anything, Diana. I don't want you losing something or breaking it in your haste to be helpful." I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I knew that arguing with her was like trying to stop the tide with a plastic shovel. She walked past me, the scent of her expensive perfume lingering in the air like a smudge. As she reached the front door, she paused, looking back at the house one last time, not with sadness, but with the satisfied expression of someone who had just won a difficult negotiation. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after the sound of her engine faded away. The house felt colder now, as if the departure of the gold ring and the crystal vase had taken a piece of its soul with them. I walked back to the living room and sat in the chair I had been gripping earlier. The velvet was soft against my skin, a stark contrast to the harshness of the conversation I just had. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a small, tarnished key that my grandmother had given me weeks before she died. She had told me to keep it safe, to wait until the right moment to use it. That moment was approaching faster than I realized. My life was a series of small, quiet victories and large, loud injustices. I was the teacher who stayed late to help a struggling reader, the woman who lived in a cramped apartment and ate generic brand cereal so she could afford to buy art supplies for her students. I was the daughter who was looked down upon by a mother who measured love in carrots. But I was also the granddaughter of a woman who knew that true value couldn't be found in a tote bag or a bank account. Evelyn Marsh had seen the way the wind was blowing, and she had made sure that when the truth finally came out, it wouldn't be Connie Hartley who held the power. I thought about the dark vault and the year 1998. It was a year of transitions, a year when secrets were buried and promises were made in the shadows. My mother thought she knew everything about her family's wealth, but she was only seeing the surface. She was so focused on the items she could touch and sell that she had completely missed the foundation they were built on. I stood up and walked to the hallway, looking at the photographs on the wall. There were pictures of my mother as a young woman, always dressed to the nines, always smiling for the camera with an expression that never quite reached her eyes. And there were pictures of me, a quiet girl with books always in my hand, looking up at my grandmother with an adoration that was pure and unfiltered. The secret I carried was not a burden, but a shield. It was the reason I could stand there and let my mother insult my life and my career without breaking. She thought she was the one in control, the one who decided who got what and who was worth what. She was wrong. The reality of our family's history was about to collide with her carefully curated present, and the impact would be more significant than any yard sale or estate liquidation. I touched the key in my pocket one last time, feeling the cold metal against my thumb. The school year was halfway over, the tire on my car was still leaking, and my mother was still convinced of her own superiority. But the clock on the wall was ticking toward a revelation that would change the Hartley name forever. Family isn't just the people who share your blood, it's the people who honor your spirit. My mother had spent 34 years treating me like a disappointment because I didn't value the same things she did. She had spent a lifetime trying to mold me into a version of herself, and when that failed, she turned to contempt. But as I looked around the house that had once been filled with warmth and laughter, I realized that I was the one who truly inherited my grandmother's legacy. I had the memories, the lessons, and the truth. Connie could have the gold ring and the crystal vase. She could have the rugs and the mahogany desk. Because when the vault finally opened, she would realize that the only thing she had actually managed to collect was a pile of beautiful, empty things that couldn't save her from the truth of what had been hidden since 1998. The contrast between our lives was not just a gap, but a sickening chasm that seemed to widen with every breath I took in that suffocating house. My mother, Connie Hartley, lives in a pristine 3,200-square-foot lake house on the outskirts of Fredericksburg, a property with a $1,400 monthly mortgage that she pays with the effortless indifference of someone who has never had to check their bank balance before swiping a card. She stood in the center of my grandmother's kitchen, the sunlight reflecting off the sapphire crystal of her $4,500 Omega Seamaster watch, a timepiece that cost more than I take home in an entire quarter of teaching. It was the Saturday after the funeral, a day that should have been reserved for quiet reflection and shared grief, but instead, it had become a clinical exercise in asset liquidation. I watched her manicured hands, which had likely never touched a bottle of bleach or a scrub brush, methodically bagging up every single item Grandma owned as if she were cleaning out a foreclosed hotel room. She didn't even spare the mundane or the personal, sweeping half-used bottles of lavender-scented Yardley London lotion and opened boxes of chamomile tea into heavy-duty plastic bags destined for a donation center or a dumpster. I stood there in my $15 Target cardigan, the fabric already starting to pill at the elbows, feeling like an intruder in the only place that had ever truly felt like home. In my hand, I gripped the only thing she hadn't bothered to claim, a chipped white ceramic coffee mug with a single fading blue stripe near the rim that we had bought together at a garage sale when I was 7 years old. To Connie, this mug was trash, a worthless piece of kitchen clutter that wasn't worth the effort to wrap in newspaper. But to me, it was the vessel that had held 1,000 Saturday morning conversations. My mother had the audacity to claim she was the sole caretaker of Evelyn Marsh, a narrative she had been spinning to her social circle at the country club for years. Yet the math of her deception was etched into the very floorboards I had spent the last 3 years maintaining. For exactly 1,095 days leading up to my grandmother's final breath, I was the one who woke up at 5 a.m. every single Saturday to make the 45-mile drive from my cramped apartment to this house. I was the one who spent my only days off scrubbing these hardwood floors on my hands and knees, cleaning out the gutters, and organizing the pill dispensers while my mother was busy attending brunch meetings and charity luncheons in Fredericksburg. She would call me once a month, usually while she was getting a $65 pedicure, to ask if the lawn had been mowed, always framing her absence as a symptom of her busy, high-stakes lifestyle. I watched her now as she moved toward the pantry, her movements sharp and efficient, driven by a greed that masked itself as organizational prowess. She didn't see the way the dust motes danced in the air, or the way the silence of the house felt heavy with the loss of a woman who had been the only anchor in my life. She only saw the potential for more space in her Lululemon tote bags. The air in the kitchen was thick with the smell of the industrial-strength cleaning wipes she was using to sanitize the counters, a harsh chemical scent that tried to erase the lingering aroma of the cinnamon and vanilla that had defined this space for decades. It was a physical assault on my memories, a systematic bleaching of a life that had been full of color and warmth. I thought about the 4 minutes of air I had to put in my tire on the way over here, the literal and metaphorical pressure that was always weighing down on my shoulders, and then I looked at my mother's polished exterior. She looked like a woman who had never known a day of true labor in her life, a woman who viewed the world as a series of transactions where she was always entitled to the profit. Her Omega watch ticked silently on her wrist, a precision instrument that measured a time she had never bothered to give to her own mother. I remembered the Saturdays when I would arrive at the house to find Grandma sitting by the window, her eyes bright with the anticipation of my arrival, because I was the only person who actually listened to her. I would spend hours listening to her talk about her youth, about the way the world looked before everything became about brands and status symbols, while I worked my way through a list of chores that Connie couldn't even be bothered to write down. My mother's definition of caretaking was a weekly 5-minute phone call filled with instructions on how to keep the property value high, while my version was the sweat on my brow and the dirt under my fingernails. The injustice of it felt like a physical weight in my chest, a pressure that made it hard to breathe as I watched her toss a set of vintage embroidered linens into a bag, labeled for goodwill. Those linens had been hand-stitched by my great-grandmother, a labor of love that spanned months, but to Connie, they were just old fabric that didn't match the minimalist aesthetic of her lake house. She turned to me then, her eyes cold and judgmental as they swept over my worn-out sneakers and the Target cardigan that she clearly considered an embarrassment to the family name. "Diana, don't just stand there clutching that old mug like it's a religious relic," she snapped, her voice cutting through the quiet of the house like a shard of glass. "If you aren't going to help me bag the rest of the glassware, at least take the trash out to the curb. We need to have this place cleared out by the end of the weekend so the real estate photographer can come in on Monday." Her words were a blunt reminder that to her, this house was no longer a home. It was a listing, a $400,000 asset that needed to be liquidated as quickly as possible. She hadn't even waited for the grass to grow over the grave before she was talking about staging and curb appeal. I looked down at the chipped mug in my hand, my thumb tracing the blue stripe, and I felt a sudden, fierce surge of protectiveness. This mug had seen more honesty and love than my mother's entire 3,200-square-foot mansion ever would. I didn't move to help her with the trash. Instead, I walked over to the small kitchen table, the one where I had sat for 3 years' worth of Saturdays, and I sat down. The wood was smooth, worn down by decades of use, a texture that felt real and grounded. My mother let out a huff of exasperated breath, a sound she reserved for when she felt I was being particularly difficult. "You really have no ambition, do you?" she asked, not really looking for an answer. "You spend your life in a classroom with children, making a pittance, and then you come here and sit in a dead woman's chair like you've inherited a throne. You could have been so much more if you hadn't inherited your father's lack of drive." She mentioned my father with the same disdain she used for the chipped mug, a man who had left her years ago because he couldn't stand the vacuum of her soul. He had been a simple man, a carpenter who valued the integrity of a well-made joint more than the name on a watch, and she had never forgiven him for not wanting to climb the social ladder with her. I looked at the $1,400 mortgage she had mentioned so many times, a figure she used to justify her supposed financial superiority, and I thought about the $42,180 I made a year. Every cent of my salary was earned through patience and dedication, through the exhaustion of teaching 24 8-year-olds how to navigate a world that was often unkind. My mother's wealth was built on the foundations of other people's labor, on the inheritance she was currently stripping from the walls of this house, and on the connections she made at those brunch meetings in Fredericksburg. She didn't understand that my choice to stay at Millbrook Elementary wasn't a lack of ambition. It was a choice to be someone who mattered in a way that couldn't be measured by an Omega watch or a Lululemon bag. As she moved into the hallway to start on the linen closet, the sound of her heels on the hardwood was rhythmic and relentless, a countdown to the moment this house would be empty. I stayed in the kitchen, the chipped mug resting on the table in front of me. I thought about the 1,095 days of service I had given to my grandmother, a gift of time and presence that my mother would never be able to comprehend. Connie thought she was winning because she was taking the gold and the crystal, but she was leaving behind the only things that truly mattered. She was leaving behind the history, the love, and the secret that I knew was hidden in the back of that mahogany desk. She was so focused on the visible wealth that she was completely blind to the true legacy of Evelyn Marsh. I took a slow sip of the cold air in the room, imagining the taste of the coffee that should have been in my mug. The house was being hollowed out, but my heart was full of a resolve I hadn't felt in years. Let her take the lavender lotion and the silver platters. Let her pretend to be the grieving, dedicated daughter to anyone who would listen at her next charity gala. The truth didn't need a $350 tote bag to carry it. The truth was sitting right here with me in a $15 cardigan and a chipped mug, waiting for the moment when the last bag was packed and the real estate photographer was gone. Because when the vault finally opened and the ghost of 1998 was revealed, my mother would find out that all her careful planning and ruthless liquidation couldn't buy her a way out of the reality she had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. Family isn't the person who manages the estate. Family is the person who holds your hand when there's nothing left to inherit. My mother had spent the last 3 years of my grandmother's life making excuses for her absence, while I had spent them making memories that no appraiser could ever value. She viewed my Saturdays as a waste of time, a menial task for a menial daughter, but those days had given me a strength she would never possess. As I sat there in the quiet kitchen, listening to the sounds of my mother dismantling a life, I realized that I wasn't the one who was poor. I was the one who had been given the keys to the kingdom, while she was just a thief in the night, stealing things that would never truly belong to her. The blue stripe on the mug seemed to glow in the fading light, a small, humble banner of my defiance in the face of her overwhelming greed. The betrayal peaked on a humid Wednesday night, the kind of evening where the air feels heavy with the scent of mown grass and the low hum of cicadas, a night that should have been peaceful, but instead became the moment my heart finally hardened against the woman who gave me life. I was sitting at my small, laminate-topped kitchen table, the one I bought for $40 at a moving sale 3 years ago, trying to grade a stack of 24 third-grade spelling tests while sipping lukewarm tea from my chipped blue-striped mug. My phone, a cracked-screen iPhone 11 that I've been nursing along because I can't justify a $1,000 upgrade on a teacher's salary, buzzed with a persistence that made me put down my red grading pen. It was a message from my cousin Tammy, a woman who usually only contacted me to gossip about the inner workings of the Hartley family drama or to complain about her latest failed diet. But this time, the message contained nothing but a single truncated eBay link. When I tapped the screen, my breath hitched in my throat as the browser loaded a page that felt like a physical blow to my chest, a listing titled Vintage 1962 Gold Wedding Band with E and R engraving, and beneath the high-resolution photo that captured every delicate scratch on the 18-karat gold surface, there it was in bold, unforgiving text, sold for $1,800. There was no mistaking it, as the engraving stood for Evelyn and Richard, the initials of 2 people who had built a life on a foundation of genuine devotion long before brand names and bank balances became the only language my mother spoke. Connie had taken the very ring my grandfather had placed on Grandma's finger 62 years ago, a piece of history that survived the birth of their children, the loss of a business, and the slow, quiet decay of age, and she had treated it like common scrap metal. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized the timing of the sale matched perfectly with a photo my mother had posted to her Instagram just 2 days prior. A picture of her 2024 Obsidian Black Mercedes-Benz GLE parked at the tire shop with a caption about how a woman in her position couldn't afford to be seen with worn-out treads. She hadn't just sold a memory, she had liquidated a sacred heirloom to pay for a new set of Michelin Pilot Sport All-Season 4 tires for her SUV, a luxury purchase that cost almost exactly what that ring had fetched from a stranger on the internet. The thought of those tires rolling over the asphalt, funded by the literal symbol of my grandparents' marriage, made the walls of my small apartment feel like they were closing in on me. I didn't even stop to think before I hit the call button, my thumbs shaking as I dialed her number, the one she usually ignored unless she needed me to do a chore she considered beneath her. She picked up on the third ring, and the background noise was the unmistakable clink of high-end crystal and the muffled laughter of a dinner party, the soundtrack of a life lived in a 3,200-square-foot lake house. I didn't lead with a greeting or a pleasantry. I simply asked her how she could do it, my voice cracking with a mixture of rage and grief that I could no longer suppress. Connie didn't even have the decency to deny it or pretend she didn't know what I was talking about, her voice coming through the speaker with a cold, sharp edge that made me feel like a child again, being scolded for an imaginary infraction. "I'm her daughter, Diana, and more importantly, I am the executor of this estate," she snapped, her words slurring just enough for me to know she was at least 2 glasses deep into a bottle of expensive Chardonnay, probably a vintage that cost more than my weekly grocery budget at the local Kroger. She told me she needed the cash for the estate taxes, a blatant lie that she delivered with the practiced ease of a career politician, knowing full well that Grandma's estate was well below the threshold for such taxes and that the liquid assets already in the bank were more than enough to cover any administrative fees. The smell of that wine seemed to permeate the air through the digital connection, a phantom scent of fermented grapes and arrogance that filled my kitchen and made me want to scrub my skin raw. I tried to tell her that the ring was supposed to stay in the family, that it was the one thing I had asked for in the wake of the funeral, but she cut me off with a laugh that was as brittle as dry leaves. "You wouldn't know what to do with a piece like that," she repeated, echoing the insult she had leveled at me in the house on Elm Street, telling me that a public school teacher had no business wearing 18-karat gold when a department store knockoff would suffice for my life. She was essentially saying that my grandmother's love was a commodity she owned, a resource she could harvest whenever her SUV needed maintenance or her lifestyle required a boost. Before I could respond, before I could tell her that I knew exactly how much those Michelin tires cost and that her excuses were as transparent as the glass she was holding, she hung up on me, the dial tone sounding like a final, mocking goodbye to the heritage she was systematically erasing. I sat there in the silence of my apartment, the only sound being the hum of my refrigerator and the distant siren of an ambulance on the main road, and I felt a shift in my soul that was permanent and profound. For 34 years, I had tried to earn her respect, to prove that my choice to educate the next generation was a noble one, but I finally understood that you cannot earn the respect of someone who only values people based on their price tag. She viewed my $42,180 salary as a badge of shame, a sign that I lacked the ambition to climb the social ladder she spent every waking hour ascending. To her, I was just a domestic worker who happened to share her DNA, a person meant to scrub the floors and take out the trash, while she curated an image of success that was built on the bones of people who actually worked for a living. The contrast between her $1,400 mortgage and my mounting student loans, between her $4,500 Omega watch and my $15 Target cardigan, had never felt more like a battlefield. I looked at the eBay listing again, staring at the grainy photo of the engraving, those 2 letters, E and R, intertwined in a script that was popular in the early 60s, a time when a wedding ring was a promise of forever, not a down payment on a set of tires. I thought about the 1,095 days I spent caring for my grandmother, the hours spent clipping her toenails and reading her the local newspaper because her eyesight was failing, while my mother was at brunch meetings in Fredericksburg discussing the aesthetics of her lake house. I had given my time, my youth, and my heart for free, while Connie was now charging the estate for every breath she took in the name of liquidation. The injustice of it was a bitter pill that I couldn't swallow, a jagged stone in my throat that made me realize the secret I had been keeping since 1998 was no longer just a burden of history. It was a weapon of justice. My grandmother had known this day would come. She had seen the hollowed-out shell of her daughter's character, and she had made sure that the real treasures were hidden where a woman like Connie Hartley would never think to look. The key in my pocket felt heavier now, a physical anchor in a world that felt like it was spinning out of control. I realized that my mother wasn't just selling jewelry, she was selling pieces of me, pieces of my childhood, and pieces of the only woman who had ever truly loved me without conditions. She thought she was the one in control because she held the title of executor, a legal term she used as a shield to justify her greed. But she was playing a game she didn't realize she had already lost. The documents in the vault, the ones my grandmother had painstakingly protected since that pivotal year in 1998, were the only things that couldn't be sold on eBay or traded for Michelin tires. They were the truth, and the truth has a way of being far more expensive than any set of luxury car parts or bottles of Chardonnay. As I looked out the window at my Civic, its tire still low and its paint fading under the streetlights, I didn't feel like the poor daughter anymore. I felt like the keeper of a flame that was about to burn down everything my mother had built. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and my mother had proven that her only loyalty was to the reflected glare of her own status. She had spent a lifetime treating me as an afterthought, a secondary character in the grand production of her life. But the script was about to change in a way she couldn't possibly anticipate. I thought about the $350 Lululemon tote bag she used to carry away the crystal and the silver, a modern, soulless vessel for a history she didn't deserve to own. I realized then that my grandmother hadn't left me the ring because she knew Connie would take it anyway. She had left me something much more powerful, something that required character and patience to handle. The ring was gone, sold to a stranger for $1,800 to fund a smoother ride for a Mercedes. But the legacy of Evelyn Marsh was still sitting in my kitchen, held in a chipped mug by a woman who knew the value of things that couldn't be appraised. My mother had the money, she had the house, and she had the tires. But she was about to find out that being an executor doesn't make you the owner of a soul, and it certainly doesn't protect you from the consequences of a betrayal that peaks on a Wednesday night. I sat in my 650-square-foot apartment that night, the walls pressing in on me with the weight of 34 years of accumulated insignificance, while the flickering light from a single overhead bulb cast long, distorted shadows across my small kitchen. The space was a far cry from the sprawling 3,200-square-foot lake house my mother occupied, a place where every room was an exercise in curated perfection, and every hallway felt like a gallery of things we couldn't actually afford to lose. My apartment, located on the third floor of a converted brick building where the radiator hissed like a trapped animal and the windows rattled with every passing freight train, was filled with the functional, the second-hand, and the ignored. I sat at my small laminate table, the surface scarred by the previous tenant's cigarette burns and my own years of grading papers, staring at that chipped white ceramic coffee mug with the fading blue stripe. It was a humble object, a piece of kitchen debris that my mother, Connie Hartley, hadn't even deemed worthy of a 30-cent donation tag at a yard sale, yet in the silence of my kitchen, it felt like the only solid thing left in my world. I reached into my junk drawer, pushing aside crumpled receipts and spare rubber bands until I found a black, permanent marker, its felt tip dry but still functional enough for what I needed to do. I turned the mug over, exposing the rough, unglazed ring on the bottom where my grandmother, Evelyn Marsh, had long ago scrawled her initials, E.M., in a shaky but determined hand to identify her property at a long-forgotten church social. I took the marker and began to trace those letters, the ink bleeding slightly into the porous ceramic as I followed the path of her handwriting, a physical connection to a woman who had been the only person to truly see me. As I traced the curves of the E and the sharp angles of the M, a cold clarity began to settle over me, replacing the frantic, vibrating grief that had consumed my chest since the funeral. I realized then that love, at least the kind practiced in the Hartley family, isn't a nebulous feeling or a warm glow. It is a ledger, a cold and unforgiving accounting of debts, credits, and withdrawals. For 30 years, my mother had been overdrawing her account with our family, writing checks of loyalty and affection that she had no intention of honoring, thinking that because she held the title of daughter and now executor, the balance would never actually come due. She had spent decades taking from my grandmother's spirit, from my father's patience, and from my own sense of self-worth, always assuming that the bank of our endurance was infinite. She wore her $4,500 Omega watch as a badge of success, oblivious to the fact that every second it ticked was a second stolen from the time she should have spent actually being a mother or a daughter. I looked around my living room, where my $15 Target cardigan lay draped over the arm of a sofa I'd found on Craigslist for $100, and I saw the evidence of my own frugality, a life lived within the narrow margins of a $42,180 annual salary. My mother saw this room as a testament to my failure, a physical manifestation of my lack of drive, but as I finished tracing the initials on the mug, I saw it differently. My account was in the black, built on the sweat of 1,095 days of actual service and the integrity of a woman who didn't need a $350 Lululemon tote bag to feel important. I decided right then, in the stark light of my $6,500 a month rental existence, that there would be no more crying over the items Connie had sold on eBay or the Michelin tires she had bought with my grandfather's wedding ring. Tears were a luxury for those who still believed the ledger could be balanced through emotion. But I was done with that particular currency. I was going to look at the facts, the hard, unvarnished data of a history that had been sitting in a dark vault since 1998, a year when the foundation of the Hartley family had cracked in a way my mother was too arrogant to notice. The facts were simple and devastating. My mother was a woman who valued the shimmer of obsidian black paint on a 2024 Mercedes-Benz GLE more than the history engraved on an 18-karat gold band. She was a woman who lied about estate taxes while sipping Chardonnay that cost more than my monthly utility bill, a woman who treated the death of her mother as a business opportunity. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the street where my 2014 Honda Civic sat under a flickering streetlight, its front left tire sagging noticeably as the slow leak continued its relentless work. In a few hours, I would have to drive to the gas station and pay for 4 minutes of air just to get to Millbrook Elementary, a ritual of survival that my mother would find pathetic. But there was a different kind of power in knowing exactly what things cost, in understanding the value of $1 and the weight of a promise, a power that Connie had traded away long ago for the sake of appearances. I felt the tarnished key in my pocket, its edges sharp against my thigh, and I realized that I wasn't just a third-grade teacher with a leaking tire. I was the auditor who had finally arrived to close the books. I thought about the dark vault and the secret it held, a secret that my grandmother had protected with the same ferocity she used to protect her garden from the summer heat. In 1998, when I was only 8 years old, I remember the hushed voices behind closed doors and the way the air in the house on Elm Street seemed to vibrate with a tension I couldn't name. My mother had been at the center of it even then, her ambition already beginning to outpace her ethics, and my grandmother had made a choice that would remain hidden for over 2 decades. Connie thought she was the one who was liquidating the past, but she was actually just clearing away the clutter so that the truth could finally be seen in the light of day. I sat back down and picked up the mug, the ink from the permanent marker now dry and permanent on the bottom, a mark of ownership that could no longer be ignored or erased. This mug was mine. The memory of those Saturdays was mine, and the documents waiting in that vault were mine by right of the 1,095 days I had spent earning them. The silence in the apartment was no longer suffocating. It was expectant, like the moment before a conductor raises their baton or a teacher begins a lesson that will change a student's life forever. I looked at the stack of spelling tests on my table, 24 lives that I was helping to shape, and I realized that my mother's disdain for my profession was her greatest weakness. She underestimated me because I didn't have a high-end watch or a lake house mortgage, assuming that because I lived a small life, I must have a small mind. She didn't understand that teachers are trained to see the patterns that others miss, to identify the quiet lies and the hidden truths in a room full of noise. I was going to use those skills now, not to teach a child how to spell, but to teach my mother the true meaning of an estate liquidation. I began to make a list on a piece of notebook paper, not of things to sell, but of the discrepancies in my mother's story, the lies she had told about the executor fees and the non-existent tax debts. Each line on the paper was a cold fact, a weight on the scale that was slowly tipping away from the woman in the obsidian black SUV. I noted the date of the eBay sale, the cost of the Michelin tires, the specific brand of the wine I had heard in the background of our last call, and the exact distance of the drive I had made every weekend for 3 years. This was the new ledger, and unlike the one my mother had been manipulating for 30 years, this one was backed by evidence that couldn't be disputed in a court of law or at a country club brunch. I felt a sense of calm that was almost surgical in its precision, a detachment that allowed me to see Connie not as a mother who had failed me, but as a debtor whose time had run out. She thought she was the one holding the Lululemon bag full of gold, but she was actually carrying a bag full of air, and the leak was much larger than the one in my Honda Civic's tire. As the clock on my wall ticked past midnight, I realized that the secret of 1998 was the key to everything, the reason my grandmother had been so insistent that I be the one to hold the tarnished key. It wasn't just about money or property. It was about the fundamental truth of who we were and where the Hartley wealth had actually come from. My mother had built her identity on a foundation of sand, and I was about to turn on the taps and let the water flow. Family isn't a safety net that catches you when you fall. Family is the bridge you build with the people who actually show up, and my mother had burned that bridge a long time ago for the sake of a better view of the lake. I touched the initials EM1 last time, feeling the slight indentation of the ceramic, and I knew that the next time I saw my mother, I wouldn't be the daughter in the $15 cardigan looking for approval. I would be the woman who knew exactly what was in the vault, and I would be the one who finally balanced the books for good. The facts were all I had left, and in the end, they were more than enough to dismantle the 3,200 square feet of lies that Connie Hartley called a life. I would go to the gas station in the morning, I would pay for my 4 minutes of air, and I would drive to the vault with the quiet confidence of someone who has already seen the end of the story. The ledger was open, the audit had begun, and for the first time in 34 years, I was the one who held the pen. My grandmother had known that the truth is a patient thing, a seed that can sit in the dark for decades before it finally breaks through the surface, and as I sat in my small, quiet apartment, I could almost feel the ground starting to shift. The time for crying was over. The time for the truth had arrived, and it was going to be the most expensive thing my mother had ever encountered, a price that no amount of sold gold or luxury tires could ever cover. The arsenal arrived not with a roar or a theatrical flourish, but in the form of a steady, professional phone call on a Tuesday morning from a woman named Patricia Cole at First Heritage Bank, a voice that sounded like crisp parchment and decades of institutional stability. I was standing in my classroom at Millbrook Elementary, the scent of tempera paint and industrial floor wax hanging in the air, when she informed me that the bank held a safe deposit box, number 1177, which had been leased specifically in my name since March of 1998. I walked into the bank the next morning, my sensible block heels clicking with a rhythmic, hollow resonance on the cold, white marble floors of the lobby, a sound that felt far more confident than the fluttering anxiety currently trapped in my chest. The bank was a temple of quiet wealth, located in a neoclassical building that seemed designed to make people with my bank balance feel small. But as I was led back into the secure area, I felt a strange sense of belonging. In a private viewing room that smelled of old, high-rag content paper, ozone from the air filtration system, and the faint metallic tang of the heavy vault door, I sat down at a polished mahogany table and waited for the heavy steel box to be placed before me. My hands were trembling slightly as I turned the tarnished key I had carried in my pocket for weeks, and when the lid creaked open, I found a thick manila envelope, the edges yellowed by 28 years of waiting in the dark. Inside the envelope was the architectural blueprint of my salvation, starting with a letter dated March 14, 1998, written in my grandmother's unmistakable, elegant cursive on stationery that felt heavy and expensive between my fingers. Alongside the letter lay a $25,000 certificate of deposit, a document that had been quietly accumulating 28 years of compound interest, now transformed from a modest sum into a staggering $62,450. But the true weight of the discovery was found in the final document, a heavy vellum deed to 1.2 acres of prime Virginia land, a plot of earth that had remained untouched and unlisted while my mother, Connie Hartley, was busy cataloging the silver and selling off heirlooms. The letter explained everything in the devastating, plain-spoken honesty that only Evelyn Marsh could provide, revealing that she had caught my mother stealing $8,000 from the family business back in the 90s to fund her first taste of the high life. Instead of a confrontation that would have likely ended in a messy public scandal, my grandmother had decided to move in silence, systematically building me a financial fortress that my mother could not even see, let alone touch. As I read the words on the page, the image of my mother in her $350 Lululemon tote bag and her $4,500 Omega watch began to shrink in my mind, replaced by the reality of her long-standing moral bankruptcy. While she was sipping Chardonnay and complaining about the cost of Michelin tires, this vault had been protecting a legacy that was designed to bypass her greed entirely. The $62,000 was more than double my annual salary of $42,180, a sum that represented a decade of freedom from the slow leak in my 2014 Honda Civic and the constant pressure of my student loans. The land was even more significant, a tangible piece of the world that belonged to me, Diana Hartley, a woman who had spent 34 years being told she didn't know what to do with nice things. My grandmother hadn't just left me money, she had left me a perspective, a way to see through the hollow pretension of the lake house and the obsidian black Mercedes to the rotting foundation beneath them. I sat in that silent room for nearly an hour, the hum of the vault's security system providing a steady backbeat to my racing thoughts as I realized the magnitude of the protection I had been granted. The year 1998 had been the turning point, the moment my grandmother realized that her own daughter was a predator who viewed family as a resource to be harvested rather than a bond to be honored. She had seen Connie's true face before I was even old enough to understand the value of $1, and she had spent the rest of her life ensuring that the predator would eventually starve. The contrast between the cold, calculated theft my mother had committed and the patient, enduring love my grandmother had exhibited was almost too much to process in the sterile quiet of the bank. I thought about the 1,095 days I had spent scrubbing those floors and reading those newspapers, and for the first time, I understood that those Saturdays weren't just about caregiving. They were the final testing ground for a legacy that had already been signed, sealed, and delivered. The documents felt warm in my hands, a physical manifestation of a woman's foresight and her refusal to let the spirit of the Hartley family be entirely consumed by materialism. I looked at the deed, tracing the legal description of the land with my finger, imagining the 1.2 acres of Virginia soil, likely covered in the same oaks and maples that shaded the house on Elm Street. This was the nice thing my mother had said I wouldn't know what to do with. A piece of property that would have been the crown jewel of her liquidation efforts if she had only known it existed. But she didn't know, and that was the most delicious part of the revelation. Her arrogance had acted as a blindfold, keeping her so focused on the visible gold and crystal that she had completely overlooked the mountain of security beneath her feet. I was no longer just a teacher in a pilled Target cardigan. I was the owner of a $62,000 safety net and a future that didn't involve begging for my mother's approval or listening to her lies about estate taxes. The ozone smell of the vault seemed to sharpen my senses as I began to plan my next move, realizing that the arsenal I now possessed was not just for my own comfort, but for the final balancing of the ledger. My mother had overdrawn her account for 30 years, and the Bank of Evelyn Marsh was finally calling in the debt with a ferocity that Connie could never have anticipated. I tucked the manila envelope back into the safe deposit box for a moment, just long enough to collect my thoughts and steady my breathing before deciding to take the copies with me into the bright, judgmental light of the afternoon. When I walked back out through the marble lobby, the clicking of my heels sounded different, no longer a hollow echo but a firm, decisive strike against the floor. The world looked the same, with the traffic moving slowly down the street and the sun reflecting off the glass of the nearby office buildings. But the ground beneath my feet had shifted irrevocably. I thought about the 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe my mother had probably been eyeing to replace her current luxury SUV, and I smiled at the thought of how little that extra chrome would matter when the truth of 1998 was finally laid bare. She had spent a lifetime trying to make me feel small, using her $1,400 mortgage and her expensive handbags as yardsticks for my worth. But she had been measuring a ghost. The real Diana Hartley was now a woman with a fortress, a woman who didn't need to ask for permission to exist or to value the things she held dear. My grandmother had seen the theft, she had seen the greed, and she had built a wall of compound interest and Virginia soil that no amount of Chardonnay-fueled gaslighting could ever penetrate. As I reached my car and looked at that sagging front left tire, I didn't feel the usual surge of panic about the cost of the repair. I simply felt a calm, steady resolve to see this through to the end. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and my grandmother had stayed with me through 28 years of silence, waiting in a dark vault for the moment I was ready to claim my inheritance. The secret of 1998 was out, and while it was a story of betrayal and theft, it was also a story of a grandmother's fierce, protective love for a granddaughter she knew would need a way out. I was that granddaughter, and I was finally stepping into the light of a reality that my mother could never liquidate or sell on eBay. The arsenal was here, the documents were real, and the ledger was about to be closed with a finality that would leave Connie Hartley with nothing but the empty, beautiful things she had stolen. I drove away from the bank, the slow leak in my tire a temporary inconvenience rather than a life-altering crisis, as I headed toward the lake house to begin the process of showing my mother exactly what a woman like me does with nice things. 2 days later, the air was thick with the suffocating humidity of a Virginia summer and the even more oppressive weight of my mother's final play for dominance as she called an emergency family meeting at her 3,200-square-foot lake house. The property, situated on a prime piece of shoreline that overlooked the shimmering gray-green water of Lake Anna, was a monument to the life Connie Hartley had spent 30 years carefully curating at the expense of everyone else's peace. As I pulled my 2014 Honda Civic into the circular driveway, the engine ticking with heat and the front left tire still holding on to its 3-day supply of air, I felt like a soldier returning to a battlefield I had already won in secret. My mother's obsidian black Mercedes-Benz GLE was parked prominently in the center of the garage, its new Michelin tires gleaming with a fresh coat of silicone shine that seemed to mock the memory of my grandmother's sold wedding ring. I stepped out of my car, adjusting the sleeves of a tailored black wool blazer I had bought on clearance at Nordstrom Rack 3 years ago, a garment that felt like a suit of armor as I tucked the heavy manila folder from First Heritage Bank under my arm. Inside the house, the central air conditioning was humming at a consistent 68 degrees, a luxury that cost her hundreds of dollars a month while I spent my summers in a $6,500 a month rental apartment with a single rattling window unit. The scene in the dining room was a masterclass in psychological warfare, a carefully staged performance designed to intimidate me into total submission. Connie had gathered 12 relatives, including my Aunt Ruth and the distant cousins from Culpeper, who only appeared when there was a scent of an inheritance or a free meal at a country club. They were seated around a massive mahogany table that was polished to such a high gloss I could see my own reflection in the wood, a dark and distorted version of the woman I used to be. At the head of the table stood my mother, wearing a navy silk blouse and a string of cultured pearls that caught the light from the crystal chandelier overhead, her eyes artificially reddened as she periodically dabbed at them with a hand-stitched silk handkerchief. To her right sat a man I didn't recognize, a lawyer in a $1,200 charcoal gray pinstripe suit who was busy arranging gold-plated pens and legal pads as if he were preparing to sign a peace treaty. The purpose of this gathering was a consent agreement, a 3-page document that would grant Connie total and irrevocable control over the remaining $115,000 from the sale of my grandmother's house on Elm Street. My mother began her speech before I had even fully pulled out my chair, her voice trembling with a rehearsed fragility that I had seen her use 1,000 times to get her way at church auctions and school board meetings. She spoke about her sacrifices, about the exhausting labor of being the sole caretaker for Evelyn Marsh, and the burden of managing an estate that she claimed was drowning in hidden debts and complex legal requirements. She told the room that she was only asking for this agreement to protect the family legacy, to ensure that the money wasn't squandered by those who didn't understand the complexities of high-level financial management. Aunt Ruth nodded solemnly, her eyes fixed on the tray of catering from a boutique deli in Fredericksburg that featured $30 a pound prosciutto and artisanal cheeses. The cousins whispered among themselves, looking at me with the same pitying expression they reserved for a stray dog or a particularly sad charity case. They saw the public school teacher in the clearance blazer, and they assumed I was here to beg for a crumb of the $115,000 that my mother was currently trying to pocket. I remained silent as she spoke, my hand resting on the cool surface of the manila folder, feeling the physical weight of the $62,450 certificate of deposit and the deed to the 1.2 acres of Virginia land hidden inside. The lawyer cleared his throat, pushing a copy of the agreement toward me with a practiced, predatory smile that suggested he had spent his entire career helping wealthy women strip their children of their rights. "Miss Hartley, it's in everyone's best interest if we finalize this today so we can move forward with the estate taxes and the closing costs," he said, his voice as smooth and artificial as the laminate on my kitchen table. My mother looked at me, her expression a calculated mixture of motherly concern and cold ultimatum, her $4,500 Omega watch catching the light as she reached for her glass of Chardonnay. She truly believed that she had won, that the presence of the lawyer and the pressure of the family would be enough to break me, but she was still operating under the assumption that I was the same girl she had been overdrawing for 30 years. I didn't reach for the pen, and I didn't look at the agreement. Instead, I opened my folder with a deliberate, slow precision that caused the room to fall into a sudden, vacuum-like silence. I looked at my mother, seeing for the first time not the giant who had towered over my childhood, but a desperate woman who had sold her own mother's wedding ring to buy tires for a car she couldn't truly afford to maintain without theft. "Before we talk about the $115,000 from the house sale, Mom, perhaps we should discuss the $8,000 you stole from the family business in March of 1998, I said, my voice steady and clear, echoing against the high ceilings of the lake house with a frequency that made the lawyer's smile falter. The color drained from my mother's face so quickly it was as if a plug had been pulled, the red blotches of her fake crying turning into a pale, sickly gray that matched the lake water outside. She tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But no sound came out as I pulled the first document from my folder, a copy of the letter from my grandmother that detailed the theft and the secret vault. Aunt Ruth leaned forward, Her interest in the prosciutto suddenly vanished as the rest of the relatives began to murmur with a new, sharper energy. This wasn't the script Connie had promised them. This was a revelation that threatened the very foundation of the image she had spent decades building. I laid the bank statement on the table, showing the $62,000 balance and the 28 years of compound interest that had been growing in the dark while my mother was busy liquidating the visible assets. I told them about the 1.2 acres of land, the prime Virginia soil that Evelyn Marsh had set aside specifically for me because she knew that her own daughter couldn't be trusted with the family's future. The contrast between my mother's $1,400 mortgage and the fortress my grandmother had built for me was now visible to everyone at the table, a financial reality that no amount of silk handkerchiefs or expensive Chardonnay could obscure. The lawyer looked at the documents, his professional mask crumbling as he realized that his client had lied to him about the extent of the estate's holdings and her own history of financial misconduct. My mother finally found her voice, but it was no longer the voice of a grieving daughter. It was a shrill, desperate rasp that cut through the air like a serrated blade. "That's mine!" she screamed, pointing a manicured finger at the deed, the pearls around her neck trembling with her rage. Anything my mother had belonged to me. "You're just a teacher. You don't even know how to pay a bill on time." But her words had lost their power, falling flat against the hard facts of the ledger I was now presenting. I looked at the relatives, the cousins from Culpeper and Aunt Ruth, and I saw the shift in their loyalty as they realized that Connie wasn't the successful executor she claimed to be. She was a woman who had been caught in a 30-year lie. I didn't feel the need to shout or to defend my profession or my life. I simply sat there in my black blazer, the auditor of a family history that was finally being set right, watching as the 3,200 square feet of my mother's life began to feel very small and very crowded. The consent agreement sat between us, a worthless pile of paper that represented the last gasp of a dying regime. I reached out and took the gold-plated pen from the lawyer's hand, but I didn't sign the document. Instead, I drew a single thick line through the signature block and pushed it back toward my mother. "The audit is over, Connie," I said, using her name for the first time in my life, feeling the weight of 34 years of silence lifting off my chest. "I'm not signing anything, and I'm not giving you control of another cent. In fact, we're going to talk about the restitution for the gold ring and the crystal, and we're going to do it in front of these witnesses." The silence that followed was total, a profound stillness that seemed to stretch from the mahogany table all the way to the bottom of the lake. My mother sank into her chair, the $1,200 suit of her lawyer no longer enough to protect her from the reality of her own actions. Family isn't just the people you share a meal with at a lake house. It's the people who are honest enough to tell you when you've lost your way. My grandmother had known that the truth would eventually require a room like this, a moment where the visible wealth collided with the hidden integrity. As I looked around the room, I realized that I was no longer the daughter who needed to be explained or the failure who made $42,000 a year. I was the woman who had held the key, who had waited for the right moment, and who had finally balanced the ledger. The secret of 1998 was no longer a secret. It was the foundation of my new life, a life built on 1.2 acres of land and $62,000 of a grandmother's love. I stood up, taking my folder and my dignity with me, leaving my mother to explain herself to a room full of people who were finally seeing her for exactly who she was. The meeting was over, but for the first time in my life, the real story was just beginning, and I was the one holding the pen. The tension in the mahogany-paneled dining room of the lake house was so thick it felt like a physical weight, pressing down on the 12 relatives who sat gathered around the table like spectators at a high-stakes trial. My mother, Connie Hartley, leaning forward with the predatory grace of someone who had already counted the money, gestured impatiently toward the 3-page consent agreement that lay between us on the polished wood. "If your grandmother had wanted you to have anything of significance, Diana, she would have made it known to the family or included it in the basic will," she declared, her voice carrying that sharp, rehearsed edge of authority she used to silence me since I was a child. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance, her $4,500 Omega watch catching the afternoon light as she tapped her manicured fingernail against the signature line, clearly expecting me to fold under the collective gaze of Aunt Ruth and the cousins from Culpeper. I didn't flinch, and I didn't raise my voice to match her rising irritation. Instead, I stood up slowly, the movement causing my chair to scrape softly against the hardwood floor, and I reached for the heavy manila folder I had been shielding like a piece of high-grade ballistic armor. Actually, Connie, she did say so, and she said it with a clarity that you clearly underestimated back in 1998, I said, my voice sounding unnervingly calm even to my own ears as I flipped open the metal clasps of the folder. I began to slide copies of the First Heritage Bank safe deposit lease and the yellowed, handwritten letter across the table, watching as they fanned out like a deck of cards across the expensive mahogany surface. I made sure a copy landed in front of Aunt Ruth, whose eyes widened behind her spectacles, and another in front of the lawyer in the $1,200 suit, whose professional composure began to visibly evaporate as he scanned the first few lines of the document. The room went lethal silent, the kind of silence that precedes a massive structural failure, a quiet so absolute that the only sound was the distant, rhythmic lap of the lake water against the shore outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. My mother's hand remained frozen in mid-air, her fingers still hovering near the silk handkerchief she had been using to dab at her manufactured tears, as the reality of the 1998 date began to register in her mind. I didn't wait for her to recover or for the lawyer to object. I picked up my own copy of the letter and began to read the words my grandmother, Evelyn Marsh, had penned in the shadows of a betrayal that had remained hidden for nearly 30 years. I read the part aloud where Grandma explicitly described the cold, calculated theft of $8,000 from the family business back in 1996, a sum that my mother had siphoned off to fund the very lifestyle she was now using to look down upon me. The letter didn't mince words, calling Connie a thief who wanted what wasn't hers and who possessed a hunger for status that outweighed her loyalty to her own blood. As the words echoed through the 3,200-square-foot house, Aunt Ruth's silver spoon slipped from her trembling fingers and hit her fine porcelain dessert plate with a sharp, crystalline clink that sounded like a gavel striking a bench. The relatives from Culpeper, who had been nodding along to my mother's speech about sacrifice and duty only moments ago, now sat back in their chairs, their expressions shifting from feigned sympathy to genuine, wide-eyed shock. My mother's face underwent a terrifying transformation, shifting from the pale, ghostly gray of a caught liar to a deep, bruised purple that started at her throat and crept up to her hairline. The mask of the devoted daughter, the one she had worn with such practiced precision during the funeral and throughout the weeks of liquidating my grandmother's estate, didn't just slip. It shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces in front of every person who actually mattered in our social and family circle. She looked at the letters E and M on the bottom of the documents, the same initials I had traced on my chipped coffee mug just nights before, and I could see the moment she realized that her mother had been playing a much longer game than she ever anticipated. The $62,450 certificate of deposit and the deed to the 1.2 acres of prime Virginia land weren't just assets. They were a posthumous indictment of her character, a fortress built specifically to keep her out. The lawyer tried to interject, his voice stuttering as he looked between the legal deed and the furious, purple-faced woman beside him. But I silenced him with a single look that carried the weight of 1,095 days of scrubbing floors and listening to the truth. This isn't about the $115,000 you're trying to hide in this consent agreement, Connie, I said, leaning over the table so I was eye to eye with the woman who had spent 34 years making me feel like a disappointment. This is about the fact that while you were at brunch meetings in Fredericksburg and buying $350 Lululemon bags, the woman you claimed to be caring for was documenting your every transgression and ensuring that your greed would eventually be your undoing. I watched as her eyes darted toward the relatives, searching for a single ally in a room that had suddenly turned hostile, but there was no one left to buy into her narrative of the ungrateful, low-earning daughter. Aunt Ruth reached out and picked up the letter, her hand shaking as she read the descriptions of the 1996 theft, her lips moving silently as she processed the depth of her own sister's deception. The room remained held in that suffocating stillness, the air conditioning continuing to hum with an indifference that felt almost mocking in the face of such a raw domestic collapse. My mother's obsidian black Mercedes-Benz GLE sat in the driveway, a monument to a life built on a foundation of stolen capital and inherited silver. But inside this room, she was stripped bare, reduced to the thief my grandmother had identified decades ago. She reached for her wine glass, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, but her hand knocked it over instead, sending a dark, spreading stain of expensive Chardonnay across the white lace tablecloth and the very consent agreement she had been so desperate for me to sign. It was the most honest thing that had happened in this house since the day it was built, a physical manifestation of the mess she had made of our family history. I looked at the bruised purple of her face and the way her pearls seemed to be choking her, and I felt a strange, detached sense of peace, a realization that the ledger was finally, irrevocably balanced. She had spent a lifetime treating me like I was unworthy of nice things, convinced that my $42,180 salary defined my limitations. But she had failed to account for the value of the truth. The secret of 1998 was no longer a burden I carried in a dark vault. It was the light that was currently burning through the fabric of her carefully curated existence. I stood there in my clearance rack black blazer, a teacher who knew how to manage a classroom and a legacy, while my mother sat in the wreckage of a 30-year lie, unable to find a single word to defend the indefensible. The cousins from Culpeper began to stand up, their desire for a free meal and a portion of the inheritance replaced by a desperate need to distance themselves from the scandal unfolding at the head of the table. They didn't look at my mother as they left. They looked at me, some with newfound respect and others with the lingering discomfort of people who had just seen a ghost. Connie remained slumped in her chair, the silk handkerchief forgotten on the floor, her eyes fixed on the spreading wine stain that was slowly soaking into the documents Grandma had left behind. She was the executor of an empty estate now, a woman who had sold a gold wedding ring for Michelin tires only to find that the road beneath her had completely disappeared. I gathered my original documents, tucking them back into my folder with the same care I used when handling my students' most important work, and I prepared to walk out of the lake house for the last time. Family isn't the name on a deed or the balance in a bank account. Family is the integrity you keep when no one is watching, and my mother had proven she had none. My grandmother had seen the theft in 1996, she had felt the betrayal in 1998, and she had spent the rest of her life preparing me for this specific Wednesday afternoon. As I walked toward the front door, the clicking of my heels on the marble foyer sounded like a final, definitive period at the end of a very long and painful sentence. I left the lake house behind, driving my 2014 Honda Civic with its slow-leaking tire away from the 3,200 square feet of bruised purple rage and shattered masks. I was heading toward 1.2 acres of land that belonged to me, carrying $62,000 worth of freedom and the knowledge that the only thing my mother had left was a pile of beautiful, expensive things that could never cover up the truth of who she really was. The fallout that followed that final, brutal confrontation at the lake house was not a chaotic explosion, but a surgical, systematic dismantling of my mother's authority and the hollow prestige she had spent 34 years constructing. Within 14 days of the family meeting, the legal documents from Safe Deposit Box 1177 were presented to the probate court, and the judge, a no-nonsense woman who looked at the 1998 letter with a grimace of pure professional distaste, signed the order to have Connie Hartley removed as the executor of Evelyn Marsh's estate. It was a swift, clinical execution of justice that stripped my mother of the one thing she valued more than her obsidian black Mercedes-Benz GLE, her control over others. The news rippled through our extended family like a toxin through a bloodstream, and the silence that followed was deafening. Aunt Ruth, the cousins from Culpeper, and even the distant relatives who used to flatter Connie for invitations to her high-end brunches stopped answering her texts and calls within the first month. She went from being the matriarch-in-waiting to a social pariah, a woman whose name became a cautionary tale whispered at Sunday dinners she was no longer invited to attend. She is currently facing a massive forensic audit of the estate funds, a process that is uncovering the thousands of dollars she already spent on her 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe, her high-performance Michelin tires, and the endless stream of expensive Chardonnay she used to numb the edges of her own insecurity. The court-appointed administrator is going through every receipt and bank statement with a fine-toothed comb, and the looming threat of a civil judgment for the restitution of the 18-carat gold wedding ring and the silver heirlooms has turned her 3,200-square-foot lake house into a gilded cage. My mother, once so obsessed with appearances, now lives in a home where the $1,400 monthly mortgage feels like a noose, and the silence in her pristine hallways is broken only by the ticking of a $4,500 Omega watch that measures a time she can never get back. She tried to call me once, her voice sounding thin and ragged over the phone as she attempted one last gaslighting maneuver, but I didn't even let her finish the sentence before I hung up and blocked her number, finally cutting the cord on a relationship that had been a slow-motion theft of my peace for 3 decades. Meanwhile, the transition in my own life has been nothing short of a rebirth, a quiet and steady emergence from the shadow of someone else's expectations. I used the $62,450 from the certificate of deposit, the fortress my grandmother built for me in 1998, to perform a miracle of my own. I paid off every cent of my mounting student loans in a single cathartic afternoon, watching the balance on the screen drop to zero with a feeling that can only be described as spiritual lightness. No longer did I have to calculate the cost of a $15 Target cardigan against the interest on my master's degree. For the first time in my adult life, every dollar of my $42,180 annual salary actually belonged to me. With the remaining funds and the sale of the 1.2 acres of prime Virginia land, which brought in a sum that would have made my mother's head spin, I put a substantial down payment on a small, sun-drenched cottage on the edge of town, a place with a wide porch and a garden that I plan to fill with the same peonies my grandmother used to grow. The cottage is only 900 square feet, less than a third of the size of the lake house, but every inch of it feels honest and earned. I moved my few belongings in a single weekend, and the first thing I unpacked was the chipped white ceramic coffee mug with the fading blue stripe, the one my mother had dismissed as worthless junk. I still drink my morning coffee from that mug every single day, sitting on my new porch as the sun rises over the maples, my thumb tracing the permanent ink initials EM on the bottom. The coffee tastes better here, perhaps because it isn't seasoned with the bitterness of a mother's disapproval or the chemical scent of industrial-strength cleaning wipes used to erase a woman's soul. My 2014 Honda Civic is still parked in the driveway, but the front left tire no longer leaks. I had it replaced with a high-quality set that I paid for with my own hard-earned money, not with the proceeds of a stolen heirloom. There is a profound, unshakable dignity in a life where your assets match your character and where your worth isn't something you have to prove to people who are too blind to see it. I think back to that Wednesday night in my $6,500 a month rental apartment, the night I decided to stop crying and start looking at the facts, and I realized that the ledger is finally beautifully balanced. The audit of my mother's life is ongoing, but my own accounts are settled. I have the memories of those 1,095 days I spent with my grandmother, the hours of scrubbing floors and listening to stories that were the real inheritance all along. Connie has the beauty, she has the brands, and she has the hollow shell of her reputation, but I have the peace that comes from knowing exactly who I am and who I am not. I am Diana Hartley, a third-grade teacher at Millbrook Elementary, a woman who knows the value of a chipped mug and the weight of a promise, and I am finally living in a world where my name is spoken with respect by the only people whose opinions matter. The cottage smells of wood smoke and lavender now, a scent that I chose for myself, and the silence here is not heavy or suffocating, but full of a quiet, vibrant potential. I spend my evenings grading papers at a kitchen table made of solid oak, a piece of furniture that will last a lifetime, and I don't feel the need to check my watch to see if I'm running out of time. My grandmother had seen the wind blowing back in 1998, and she had planted a seed of justice that took 28 years to bloom, but the wait was worth every second of the struggle. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out. And while my biological mother chose to be a thief in the night, my grandmother chose to be a guardian in the dark. As I take a final sip of coffee and look out at the land that is truly mine, I realize that the greatest nice thing I ever inherited wasn't the money or the deed. It was the courage to walk away from a toxic legacy and build a fortress of my own out of nothing but the truth and a chipped ceramic mug. The legal proceedings against Connie will likely drag on for years as the court-appointed administrator uncovers more discrepancies in her handling of the estate. But I am no longer a participant in that drama. I have provided my testimony, I have handed over the documents, and I have closed the door on that chapter of my history with a finality that is as solid as the stone foundation of my cottage. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that she had to list the lake house for sale to cover her mounting legal fees and the restitution costs, and while a part of me felt a flicker of the old sadness, it was quickly replaced by a sense of cosmic symmetry. She spent her life liquidating other people's memories for her own comfort, and now she is being forced to liquidate her own comfort to pay for her crimes. It is a cold, hard fact of life that the balance always comes due, and for Connie Hartley, the debt is finally being called in by the very mother she tried to erase. I walk inside and rinse my mug in the sink, the water running warm and clear over the blue stripe that has survived decades of use and neglect. I place it carefully on the shelf, next to a set of simple, sturdy plates that I bought for my new life. There are no silk handkerchiefs here, no $1,200 suits, and no $4,500 watches measuring out a life of pretension. There is only the quiet, steady rhythm of a life lived with integrity, a life that my grandmother would have recognized and been proud of. The secret of 1998 is no longer a secret, and the dark vault is empty, its contents now transformed into the walls and roof that protect me from the storms. I am no longer anyone's disappointment, and I am no longer overdrawing an account that was never meant for me. I am home, and for the first time in 34 years, the peace I feel is not a temporary reprieve, but a permanent, unassailable inheritance that no one can ever take away from me again. The sun is fully up now, lighting up the kitchen and reflecting off the simple gold band I bought for myself, a modest piece of jewelry that represents my own commitment to my future. I pick up my keys and head out to my car, ready to spend another day with 24 children who are learning that their value isn't found in what they own, but in who they choose to be. As I pull out of the driveway of my cottage, I don't look back at the life I left behind. I only look forward to the road ahead, a road that is smooth and clear and entirely my own. The audit is finished, the ledger is closed, and the story of the Hartley family has finally found its true, honest ending in the quiet strength of a woman who knew what to do with the nice things she was given.